December 7th, 1942. The morning sun climbed over the Tunisian hills near Tiburba as Sergeant Marco Bellini peered through the commander's periscope of his Carro Armato M13/40. Through the dust and heat shimmer, he spotted them for the first time, American tanks, M4 Shermans, 5 of them, advancing in a loose formation across the valley floor. Bellini called down to his gunner, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had studied intelligence reports and believed what they said. The Americans bring their medium tank, 75mm gun. Our 47 can match it. Watch their armor. It is thick, but our shells will find weak points. His crew had heard the rumors. American tanks were numerous, well supplied, mechanically reliable, but the Italian tankers who had fought British Crusaders and Grants knew that guns and armor decided tank battles. The Sherman mounted a 75mm gun in a fully rotating turret, respectable. The M13/40 mounted a 47mm Breda. Smaller, yes, but Italian gunners were skilled. Italian commanders were experienced. They had fought since 1940. What Sergeant Bellini and thousands of Italian tankers could not know as they prepared to engage American armor for the first time was that they were about to discover something far more devastating than superior firepower. They were about to learn that modern armored warfare was not won by guns alone, but by a combination of factors they had never properly valued: reliability, maintainability, crew ergonomics, optical quality, ammunition storage, training time, logistical support. The Sherman excelled in all of these categories, while the M13/40 failed in most. Over the coming months, Italian tank crews would transform from skeptics who believed their 47mm gun could compete into witnesses of a harsh truth. They were fighting a war with equipment that represented an older generation of armored warfare against an opponent who had moved beyond their understanding. This is not a story about the Sherman's gun. This is a story about everything else. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The seeds of Italian confidence were planted in the design rooms of Fiat Ansaldo in 1937. The Italian Royal Army had issued specifications for a new medium tank to replace the aging L3 tankettes and the fundamentally flawed M11/39, which mounted its main gun in the hull rather than a turret. The result was the Carro Armato M13/40, named for its weight of 13 tons and its projected introduction year of 1940. On paper, the specifications seemed adequate for the era. The tank mounted a 47mm Breda Model 35 gun in a fully rotating turret, a significant improvement over its predecessor. This gun could fire armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating 88mm of vertical armor at 100 meters according to test data, though this figure dropped significantly against sloped or face-hardened armor at combat ranges. The armor protection ranged from 30mm on the frontal hull to 42mm on the turret front. 4 crew members operated the vehicle. A driver and hull machine gunner radio operator in the lower hull, while the commander gunner and loader worked in the 2-man turret. The diesel engine, a Fiat SPA 8 tons producing 125 horsepower, gave the 14-ton vehicle a top speed of 32 km per hour and a range of 200 km on roads. Production began in the late 1940 at Ansaldo Fossati factories, with Fiat supplying engines and Breda delivering weapons. By December 1940, monthly production reached 60 to 70 tanks. Over 700 units of the M13/40 would roll off assembly lines before production shifted to the improved M14/41 variant with a more powerful engine. In total, over 3,000 tanks would be built on this chassis, or its derivatives, providing the bulk of Italian armoured forces throughout the war. Italian tank commanders in late 1940 and early 1941 believed the M13/40 represented their entrance into modern armoured warfare. Intelligence reports confirmed that the 47mm gun could penetrate British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges. The armour protected against British 2-pounder guns at most engagement distances. Tank crews felt adequately equipped to fight. They had no way of knowing that this confidence rested on a fundamental misunderstanding about what modern mechanized warfare demanded from its vehicles. The first M13/40 tanks arrived in North Africa in late 1940, equipping the Babini Armoured Brigade Group. These crews received approximately 3 to 4 weeks of tank training before deployment, a fraction of what British or German crews received. Most units were hastily formed, lacking the cohesion that comes from extended training together. Many tanks initially lacked radios, forcing commanders to communicate through hand signals or by dismounting, a critical tactical disadvantage in mobile warfare. The baptism of fire came during Operation Compass, the British counter-offensive that began in December 1940. At the Battle of Bardia from January 3 to 5, 1941, Australian infantry, supported by Matilda tanks, attacked Italian positions defended by M13/40 tanks. The engagement exposed fundamental problems that had nothing to do with the 47mm gun's penetration capability. In 3 days of fighting, Australian forces suffered 456 casualties, while Italian forces lost over 40,000 men, including approximately 2,000 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 36,000 captured. Italian tankers who survived reported chaos and confusion. Most vehicles had no radios. When British artillery opened fire, tanks could not coordinate responses or share targeting information. Many tanks were destroyed by infantry anti-tank guns before they could even identify targets through their limited vision devices. Those M13/40 seconds that did engage enemy armour found their shells effective against British light tanks and occasionally against cruiser tanks at close range. But the crews were too few, too scattered, too poorly coordinated to exploit any tactical advantages. The problem was not entirely the tank itself. In early 1941, the M13/40's main gun could penetrate most British cruiser tanks at normal combat ranges of 500 to 1,000 metres. Its armour was comparable to opponents like the British Crusader Mark I and Mark II. The basic design was conventional, but adequate for its time. The true weaknesses lay in training, doctrine, combined arms coordination, and support infrastructure. Italian tank crews lacked proper instruction in armoured tactics. Recovery vehicles were virtually non-existent, meaning disabled tanks were often abandoned even when repairable. Maintenance in the harsh desert environment overwhelmed under-trained mechanics who lacked proper tools and spare parts. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of North African coastline, making it difficult to sustain operations far from ports. By April 1941, when the German Afrika Korps arrived in force under General Erwin Rommel, the Italians fielded approximately 240 M13 and M14 tanks in first-line service. These crews had learned hard lessons from the early defeats. Training improved as new tank training centres opened in Italy. Crews became more proficient with their weapons and more skilled at coordinated movement. Radios became standard equipment across most units. Italian tankers learned to work alongside German units, coordinating attacks and sharing intelligence. They could fight, and fight they did. At the First Battle of Bir el Gubi on November 19, 1941, Italian M13/40 tanks from the Ariete Armoured Division engaged British armour in a day-long battle. The engagement demonstrated that improved Italian crews with proper training could hold their own against British Crusader tanks armed with 2-pounder 40mm guns. Both tanks were vulnerable to each other's weapons at typical combat ranges. Both had strengths and weaknesses. The battle raged across the desert as columns of smoke rose from burning vehicles on both sides. By late afternoon, British forces withdrew, leaving behind 42 to 52 destroyed Crusaders, according to various estimates. The Italians lost 34 tanks, many recoverable. It was a tactical victory that proved Italian tankers had come far from the confusion of Bardia. They had learned their machines. They understood fire and manoeuvre. Given proper training, adequate support, and competent leadership, they could match their opponents. During the Gazala battles in May and June 1942, Italian armour continued to prove effective in certain circumstances. On June 12, 1942, M13/40 tanks from the Trieste Motorized Division engaged British Grant tanks in fighting south of Knightsbridge. Multiple Allied tanks were destroyed in close-range engagements. Italian crews used speed, positioning, and terrain to their advantage. They closed distance rapidly and aimed for tracks, sides, and rear armour where their 47mm shells could penetrate. It was desperate work requiring courage and skill, but it demonstrated that Italian tankers could fight effectively when circumstances allowed. Yet, even as Italian crews became more skilled and confident, the technological gap widened steadily. In early 1942, the British began deploying the American-built M3 Grant medium tank in significant numbers. The Grant mounted a 75mm gun in a hull sponson with limited traverse, plus a 37mm gun in a fully rotating turret. Though the hull-mounted 75 could only traverse 15 degrees, it outranged the Italian 47mm weapon and could penetrate Italian armour at distances where Italian shells were ineffective. Italian tankers quickly learned to fear the Grant. Its 75mm gun fired a much heavier shell with greater kinetic energy. At ranges beyond 800 metres, the Grant could destroy M13/40 tanks while remaining effectively immune to return fire. Italian crews had to close to suicidal ranges to have any chance of penetration, exposing themselves to devastating fire during the approach. The M13/40's inherent weaknesses became more apparent with each passing month of combat. The riveted construction meant that when shells struck the armour, even without fully penetrating, the rivets could shear off and become deadly projectiles inside the crew compartment. Men were killed or wounded by their own tank's construction when enemy shells struck without penetration. The bolted hull plates had a tendency to crack under stress, particularly around the driver's position. The two-man turret forced the commander to act as both tactical leader and primary gunner, dividing his attention and slowing reaction times. A British or German tank commander could focus on identifying targets, coordinating with other tanks, and directing his driver, while a dedicated gunner handled the weapon. In Italian tanks, the commander had to do everything, making quick target engagement nearly impossible. The engine, though reliable by Italian standards, was underpowered for the tank's weight, especially when crews added sandbags or spare track links for extra protection against anti-tank rifles. The suspension, adequate for Italian roads, suffered in the harsh desert environment where sharp rocks and rough terrain caused frequent failures. Tank crews recognized these problems and attempted various field modifications to improve their vehicles. Many piled sandbags on the glacis plate to add protection against anti-tank rifles and shell fragments. Others welded additional track links to vulnerable areas, hoping the extra steel would deflect or absorb shells. But these modifications made the already underpowered and slow tanks even slower and increased mechanical breakdowns from overtaxed engines and transmissions. Italian commanders discouraged the practice, but desperate crews continued it anyway, preferring reduced mobility to certain death from penetration. The Italian army recognized the firepower problem and attempted to address it through support vehicles. Beginning in 1942, each tank battalion included at least one company equipped with semovente 75/18 self-propelled guns. These turretless vehicles mounted a 75mm howitzer on the M13/40 chassis and could fire shaped charge high-explosive anti-tank shells capable of penetrating Allied armour at respectable ranges. The semoventi provided crucial fire support that helped offset the medium tank's weaknesses against Grant tanks and improved British cruisers. But the semoventi were not tanks in the traditional sense. They could not engage in mobile tank versus tank combat like the M13/40. They lacked the turret traverse for rapid target engagement. They required careful positioning and were vulnerable if flanked, and there were never enough of them to adequately support all the tank battalions that needed their firepower. Then came November 1942 and the entry of American forces into the North African campaign. Operation Torch brought Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, opening a second front that would trap Axis forces between the British 8th Army, advancing from Egypt, and American and French forces advancing from the west. With the Americans came a tank that would fundamentally change Italian tankers' understanding of what modern armor could be. The M4 Sherman medium tank. Lieutenant Antonio Ferrara first saw a Sherman on December 9, 1942, near Tibourba in Tunisia. His platoon of 3 M14/41 tanks, slightly improved versions of the M13/40 with more powerful engines, had taken up positions on a ridge overlooking a valley where American forces were reported to be advancing. Through his commander's periscope, Ferrara studied the approaching American column. The tanks were larger than he expected, taller. The hulls seemed to slope at angles designed for deflection. Even at over a kilometre away, he could see they moved with what seemed like confidence, not the hesitant, stop-and-go movement of tanks worried about mechanical failure. These vehicles advanced steadily, maintaining formation, their long gun barrels tracking potential threats as they moved. Ferrara called his observations to the other tank commanders using the radio net. The Americans bring many tanks. They appear well organized. Estimate company strength, perhaps 15 vehicles. We will engage at 600 meters when they enter the kill zone. Aim for tracks and suspension first, then sides if they turn. His gunner, Corporal Giuseppe Martelli, had fought at Gazala and knew the drill. 600 meters was close, dangerously close, but necessary against tanks with thick frontal armor. At that range, the 47mm might penetrate sides or rear. Might. The word carried weight. Might penetrate. Might be disabled. Might survive long enough to fire more than once. The Shermans reached the planned engagement range. Ferrara gave the order. Fire. 3 47mm shells lanced across the valley toward the lead Sherman tanks. Martelli, an excellent gunner who had destroyed 2 British Crusaders at Gazala, aimed carefully at the lead tank's track assembly. The shell struck with a sharp crack audible even inside the closed tank. A hit. But the Sherman did not stop. It did not even slow. The shell had struck the tracks but failed to break them, merely scarring the steel. Before Ferrara could order a second shot, the Sherman's turret traversed with mechanical precision toward his position. The 75mm gun elevated slightly, correcting for range. Then it fired. The Sherman's shell struck Ferrara's M14/41 on the turret front. The 42mm armour, adequate against British 2-pounder guns, meant nothing against the 75mm M3 gun firing armour-piercing rounds. The shell penetrated completely, passing through the turret front, through Martelli, who was killed instantly, through the rear turret wall, and out the back of the vehicle in a fraction of a second. The interior was filled with fragments of armour, shell casing, and equipment. Ferrara, wounded by shell fragments in his shoulder and face, ordered the driver to reverse immediately. The tank lurched backward, trailing smoke but still mobile. They had survived only because the Sherman's shell had missed the ammunition storage and engine. Of the 3 Italian tanks in Ferrara's platoon, 1 was destroyed with all crew killed, 1 was disabled with the driver and hull gunner wounded, and Ferrara's tank escaped damage. They had engaged 5 Shermans at what Italian doctrine considered optimal range. They had achieved 1 track hit that caused no damage. In return, they had lost 2 tanks in under 2 minutes of combat. This pattern would repeat across Tunisia through December 1942 and into early 1943 as American forces expanded their operations and Italian tankers encountered Shermans with increasing frequency. Every engagement taught the same brutal lesson. The Sherman was not just another Allied tank to be respected and engaged carefully like the Grant. It was fundamentally superior in nearly every measurable way. The M4 Sherman medium tank represented a generation beyond what Italian engineers had conceived when designing the M13/40. Where the Italian tank weighed 14 tons, the Sherman weighed 30 tons in its most common variant. Where the M13/40 had 30 to 42 millimeters of flat riveted armour, the Sherman had 51 millimeters of frontal hull armour, heavily sloped at 56 degrees for superior deflection, and 76 millimeters on the gun mantlet. Against the Sherman's sloped frontal armour, Italian 47mm shells had virtually no chance of penetration except at point-blank range under 100 meters. The effective thickness of the sloped armor was much greater than its actual measurement. A shell striking at an angle had to pass through more steel and was more likely to deflect than penetrate. Italian crews could only hope to penetrate a Sherman from the sides at ranges under 500 meters, or from the rear, or by targeting the tracks and suspension in hopes of immobilizing it for supporting weapons to finish. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, in contrast, could penetrate the M13/40's thin, unsloped, riveted armor from the front at any combat range. At 1,000 meters, the Sherman's gun could punch through over 70 millimeters of vertical armor. Against the M13/40's 30mm frontal hull and 42mm turret front, both unsloped and riveted, the shells were devastating. The Sherman could destroy an Italian medium tank from any angle at any range where the gunner could see the target clearly enough to aim, but the gun and armor told only part of the story. What truly shocked Italian tankers, as they engaged Shermans through the winter of 1942–43, was not just that they were outgunned and under-armored. They had experienced that against Grant tanks. What shocked them was discovering how thoroughly the Sherman surpassed their tanks in every other category they had barely considered important. The Sherman was faster, despite being more than twice as heavy. Its Continental R975 radial engine, in the most common variant, produced 400 horsepower, more than 3 times the M14/41's 145 horsepower. This gave the Sherman superior acceleration, better hill climbing ability, and higher sustained cross-country speed. Italian tanks that attempted to flank Shermans discovered the American tanks could reposition faster than the supposedly more mobile Italian vehicles. The 5-man crew was properly distributed with a dedicated commander freed from gunnery duties. The commander could focus entirely on tactical awareness, identifying targets, coordinating with other tanks, and directing the driver, while a dedicated gunner handled weapon operation. This seemingly simple difference in crew organization meant Shermans could identify and engage targets much faster than Italian tanks, where the commander had to do everything. The communication systems were excellent. Every Sherman had a radio. Every crewman had an intercom headset, allowing instant communication without shouting over engine noise. The radios themselves were reliable, powerful, and could communicate over distances that Italian radios could not match. Sherman platoons could coordinate complex maneuvers, while Italian platoons struggled with basic communication. The suspension handled rough terrain better, providing a more stable firing platform and causing less crew fatigue during long movements. The transmission was easier to operate with synchronized gears that made shifting smooth even for inexperienced drivers. The vision devices were superior, giving the crew better situational awareness. The ammunition storage was better protected with wet stowage systems that reduced fire risk when hit. In every measurable category, except perhaps fuel consumption and strategic mobility by rail, the Sherman was superior, and fuel consumption mattered little when the Americans had abundant logistics and the Italians were running short of everything. The first large-scale engagements between Italian armor and American Shermans came during the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943. German forces under Rommel launched an offensive designed to disrupt American positions and buy time for Axis forces compressed in Tunisia. Italian armor participated in supporting attacks, engaging American units that were still learning armored warfare but were equipped with superior vehicles. The Centauro Armored Division, equipped with approximately 60 M14/41 tanks and supporting semovente self-propelled guns, engaged elements of the American 1st Armored Division near Sidi Bouzid on February 14th and 15th. The battle became a chaotic, swirling engagement across desert terrain, where American forces, though tactically inexperienced, held material advantages that increasingly decided outcomes. Italian tank crews fought with desperate courage, using every tactic they had learned through 3 years of North African combat. They attacked at dawn when visibility favored close-range engagement. They used terrain to mask their approaches, advancing through wadis and behind ridgelines. They targeted tracks and suspensions rather than attempting frontal penetrations. They relied heavily on supporting semovente guns and towed anti-tank artillery to engage American armor, while their tanks provided mobile fire support and pursued exposed targets. But tactics could only compensate so much for material inferiority. When Italian 47mm shells struck Sherman frontal armor at combat ranges, they bounced off or shattered against the sloped steel. When Sherman 75mm shells struck Italian armor, they penetrated and killed. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Italian tanks had to close to suicidal ranges to have any chance of destroying a Sherman. Shermans could engage and destroy Italian tanks at any range where they could see them. Sergeant Carlo Rossini of the Centauro Division survived the battle at Sidi Bouzid and later wrote in a letter that passed through military censors. "We fought as well as we could with what we had. Our gunners were skilled. Our commanders were experienced. Our tactics were sound. But we fired shells that bounced off American tanks while their shells destroyed us from distances we could not match. It was like fighting with swords against rifles. Courage meant nothing against such disparity. The Battle of Kasserine Pass ended with a tactical German-Italian victory that pushed American forces back and inflicted significant casualties. But the strategic situation remained hopeless. The Axis forces in Tunisia were trapped between the British 8th Army advancing from the east and American-French forces pressing from the west. Supplies ran short. Reinforcements could not arrive. Fuel stocks dwindled. Spare parts became impossible to obtain. For Italian tank crews, every engagement consumed irreplaceable vehicles. Tanks disabled by track damage were abandoned because no recovery vehicles existed to tow them. Tanks with thrown tracks or broken suspension were left in the desert because mechanics lacked parts. Tanks with engine problems sat immobilized because replacement engines could not be delivered. The attrition was relentless and unsustainable. By March 1943, Italian armoured units were shadows of their former strength. The Centauro Division, which had begun the Tunisia campaign with approximately 60 tanks, could field fewer than 20 operational vehicles. The Ariete Division, rebuilt after its destruction at El Alamein, struggled to maintain even platoon strength formations. Individual tank companies reported having only 2 or 3 operational tanks. Meanwhile, American tank battalions maintained high operational readiness through superior logistics and mechanical reliability. Shermans that threw tracks could be repaired in hours by trained mechanics with proper equipment. Shermans, with engine problems, received replacement power plants from well-stocked supply depots. Shermans damaged in combat were recovered by dedicated tank recovery vehicles and returned to service after repair. The American sustainment system kept tanks operational through a combination of reliability, maintainability, and logistical support that Italian forces could not match. Lieutenant Ferrara recovered from his wounds at Tiburba and returned to duty commanding a replacement M14A3E2, experienced the final phase of the Tunisia campaign with growing despair. His tank was in poor condition. The engine burned oil and overheated frequently. The transmission had developed a troubling grinding noise in third gear that mechanics could not fix because they lacked replacement parts. The gun recoil mechanism had lost pressure, making accurate firing difficult. The radio worked intermittently. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These problems were normal by March 1943. Every Italian tank in Tunisia was worn out, breaking down, barely functional. There were no replacements, no spare parts, no mechanics with proper tools. The tanks fought on because the crews were ordered to fight, not because the vehicles were capable of effective combat. On April 9, 1943, Ferrara's platoon engaged American tanks near El Guettar. They fought from prepared positions with good fields of fire, following proper defensive doctrine. It made no difference. The Shermans advanced methodically, halting at 1,200 meters to engage with their 75mm guns. From that range, Italian tankers could only watch helplessly as shell after shell struck their positions. Ferrara's tank was hit twice. The first shell penetrated the turret side, killing the loader and wounding the gunner. The second shell struck the engine compartment, and the tank caught fire. Ferrara and his driver escaped through the top hatches as flames consumed the vehicle. They watched it burn, black smoke rising into the clear desert sky, and both men knew the same truth. This was over. Not just this battle, but everything. Italy had lost the war. The end came in May 1943. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia on May 13th. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners, including virtually all remaining Italian armoured forces in North Africa. Among them were the survivors of tank units that had fought since 1940, veterans who had experienced every phase of the North African campaign from the first confused encounters with British armour to the final hopeless battles against American Shermans. These men entered Allied captivity with mixed emotions that they would later describe in letters and post-war interviews. Relief that the fighting was over, that they had survived when so many comrades had not. Shame that Italy had been so thoroughly defeated that their sacrifices had accomplished nothing. Anger at leadership that had sent them to war with inadequate equipment and impossible missions. But also a strange curiosity about their captors, these Americans who had defeated them with such material superiority. What came next would prove even more psychologically transformative than the battlefield defeats. Italian prisoners of war would be shipped to the United States itself, where they would witness firsthand the industrial capacity that had produced the Sherman tanks, the industrial society that had made their defeat inevitable. They would see abundance on a scale that made propaganda claims about American weakness seem absurdly false. They would discover that everything they had been told about democratic capitalism was a lie. The transformation from defeated soldiers into witnesses of a better system was just beginning. The voyage across the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 took approximately 2 weeks aboard American Liberty ships. Several thousand Italian prisoners from Tunisia were loaded onto these vessels for transport to prisoner of war camps in the United States. The ships themselves provided the first revelation about American industrial power that went beyond anything the prisoners had experienced on the battlefield. Lieutenant Ferrara, his shoulder wound healed but leaving a visible scar, stood on the deck of the SS John W. Brown as it departed from Oran, Algeria. He watched the North African coast recede into the distance and wondered what awaited in America. The propaganda he had been taught since youth depicted Americans as weak, decadent, culturally inferior, a mongrel society of immigrants without true national character, a nation more concerned with comfort and profit than military strength or national glory. Yet these supposedly weak and decadent Americans had produced the Sherman tanks that had crushed Italian armour. They had produced the trucks, aircraft, artillery, and supplies that equipped armies on multiple continents. They had fought effectively despite propaganda claims that democratic soldiers lacked the discipline and courage of fascist warriors. Every assumption Ferrara had been taught was now suspect, undermined by direct experience of defeat. The Liberty ships themselves contradicted the propaganda narrative. These vessels, built to transport cargo across the Atlantic to supply Allied forces, were monuments to mass production capability. The famous SS Robert E. Peary had been launched after just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes of construction at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California in November 1942, though additional fitting out extended the total delivery time to several weeks. Normal construction time averaged 30 to 42 days by 1943, and at peak production, American shipyards completed Liberty ships at a rate approaching 3 per day across multiple facilities. Italian prisoners discussed these facts in hushed conversations on deck, 3 ships per day. Italy's entire shipbuilding industry could not match what one American company produced in a month. The implications were staggering. If Americans could build cargo ships this fast, what else could they produce at similar rates? How many tanks? How many aircraft? How many trucks, guns, and shells? The abundance became apparent immediately. American sailors ate meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, white bread, and milk. Real milk, not the thin reconstituted powder that had been standard in Italian military rations. The portions were generous, more food than Italian soldiers had seen except during the rare periods when supply lines were functioning well, and the waste shocked the Italian prisoners beyond comprehension. Sailors threw away half-eaten food. They discarded bread that was slightly stale but perfectly edible. They poured out excess coffee, dumped leftover vegetables, and scraped meat scraps into garbage bins. Things that would have been treasured in Italy, carefully saved and consumed to the last crumb, were thrown away without thought because the supply seemed endless, because more food would be available at the next meal, because abundance was simply assumed. Sergeant Rossini, recovering from burns received when his tank was destroyed, worked in the galley as assigned labour under Geneva Convention rules that allowed prisoners to perform non-combat work. He witnessed the food preparation process and couldn't reconcile what he saw with his understanding of wartime economies. The ship's galley had walk-in refrigerators, keeping meat and dairy fresh for weeks, electric ovens that could bake hundreds of loaves of bread simultaneously, industrial mixers that prepared dough in minutes, gas ranges with precise temperature controls. More disturbing was the required surplus. American regulations mandated preparing 10% extra food beyond calculated requirements to ensure no one went hungry. This surplus, perfectly good food that simply exceeded immediate needs, was discarded daily. Fresh bread, good vegetables, excess meat, all thrown overboard because American supply doctrine required guaranteed abundance rather than calculated sufficiency. Rossini wrote in a letter to his family that later passed through censors, describing his shock in carefully neutral language. The Americans waste more food each day than our village saw in months before the war. Not spoiled food or damaged supplies, but good bread, fresh vegetables, meat without any defects. They require excess to guarantee no one experiences hunger. They have so much that deliberate waste is built into their system as insurance against shortage. When the Liberty ships approached the American coast and docked at Hampton Roads, Virginia, in August 1943, the Italian prisoners received their first view of American industrial infrastructure on home territory. The naval base sprawled across thousands of acres. Dozens of ships in various stages of loading and unloading filled the docks. Electric cranes lifted cargo that would have required gangs of labourers working for hours in Italian ports. The facility operated 24 hours continuously, ablaze with electric lights even at night, as though electricity was so abundant that conservation was unnecessary. Former factory workers from Italian industrial cities like Milan and Turin, men who understood manufacturing and logistics, stood at the ship's rail-counting vessels and calculating throughput capacity. They noted that individual cranes moved more material in an hour than Italian dock workers could handle in a full day's labour. Everything ran on electricity. Everything was mechanized. Everything operated with an efficiency that seemed impossible based on what they knew of Italian or even German industrial capacity. The prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport inland to prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American interior. Not cattle cars or box cars as might be expected for enemy prisoners, but actual passenger coaches with padded seats and windows. The journey would take several days, passing through Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and into Texas and Oklahoma, where many camps were located in areas with climates similar to North Africa and suitable for training troops destined for Mediterranean operations. Along the way, Italian prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that contradicted every propaganda claim they had absorbed during years of fascist education. Every small town blazed with electric lights. Not just major cities or industrial centres, but ordinary rural towns had streetlights, illuminated shop windows displaying consumer goods, houses with lights visible in multiple rooms. Factories ran night shifts, their parking lots filled with workers' automobiles. Automobiles, hundreds of them, thousands of them, everywhere the train passed. In Italy, private car ownership was a privilege of the wealthy elite and party officials. Here in America, ordinary workers drove personal vehicles to their factory jobs. The parking lots outside industrial facilities contained more automobiles than existed in entire Italian provinces. Captain Aldo Benedetti, a tank company commander who had fought from Libya through Tunisia, had travelled extensively in Germany before the war during military exchange programs. He noted in letters that every American town they passed, even small rural communities, had more electric lighting than Rome. They passed factories larger than anything he had seen in Milan, Turin, or any German industrial city. At midnight, they observed parking lots filled with hundreds of cars belonging to workers on night shifts. Night shift workers owned personal automobiles. In America, this was considered normal, rather than extraordinary. The trains passed near industrial facilities that demonstrated American manufacturing capacity in ways that mere statistics could never convey. Near Louisville, Kentucky, the prisoners glimpsed synthetic rubber production complexes. Multiple massive factories, each employing thousands of workers, formed part of a national program that produced over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually by 1945. Louisville's facilities alone contributed nearly 200,000 tons at peak production. Italy and Germany combined could not match the total American synthetic rubber output. This single category of industrial production, necessary because Japanese conquests had cut off natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia, exceeded the total capability of both Axis powers, and synthetic rubber was just one product among thousands that American industry manufactured in overwhelming quantities. Near Detroit, Michigan, the trains slowed as they passed Ford's Willow Run bomber plant. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced B-24 Liberator bombers at peak rates of one aircraft every 63 minutes. At its height in 1944, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from over 1.5 million parts manufactured by 1,500 subcontractors across the United States. The plant was visible for miles, a structure so impossibly large that it seemed like something from science fiction rather than actual industrial reality. Italian prisoners who had served in the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, recognized immediately what they were seeing. That one factory produced more aircraft in a single month than all of Italy's aircraft industry produced in a year. They had flown missions over British positions and wondered where the seemingly endless supply of enemy aircraft came from. Now they knew the answer, and British aircraft production was insignificant compared to American output. The prison camps themselves provided the next level of revelation about American society and its approach to human welfare. Camp Hearn in Texas, one of several dozen facilities housing Italian prisoners across the United States, held approximately 5,000 men in wooden barracks equipped with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat for winter months. The camp hospital had X-ray machines, modern surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies superior to most civilian hospitals in Italy before the war. The daily food ration provided to prisoners included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that Italian civilians had not seen since before the war began. The rations exceeded what Italian soldiers had received even during the best periods when supply lines were functioning well. Prisoners gained weight. Men who had been gaunt from years of inadequate field rations filled out, their health improving noticeably within weeks of arrival. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty discovered walk-in refrigerators, maintaining precise temperatures, electric mixers that prepared dough effortlessly, and gas ranges that could cook meals for thousands with simple temperature adjustments. The 10% surplus food prepared to ensure everyone received full rations was discarded daily according to regulations. Fresh bread, perfectly good vegetables, excess meat, all thrown away because American policy required guaranteed abundance rather than accepting any risk of shortage. Sergeant Rossini, assigned to kitchen duty at Camp Hearn, experienced moral anguish that he attempted to express in carefully worded letters home. "We throw away more food each day than our entire village saw in months before I was conscripted. Not spoiled food, not damaged supplies, but fresh bread that could feed families, good vegetables without defects, meat that would be precious at home. The Americans require this excess by regulation to guarantee no prisoner experiences hunger. They have so much that institutional waste is policy rather than failure." By autumn of 1943, chronic labor shortages in American agriculture and industry led to programs employing Italian prisoners in work details under Geneva Convention rules. Prisoners could not work directly on war production, but they could labor in industries that freed American workers for military service or defense manufacturing. This meant Italian tankers, men who had fought American forces in the North African desert, now witnessed American productive capacity firsthand as workers, rather than merely as observers. At farms in Nebraska, Italian prisoners worked wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. A single combine harvester operated by one farmer did the work of 100 men using traditional Italian agricultural methods with hand tools and animal labor. Crop yields reached 60 bushels per acre, double what Italian farms achieved on their best land using intensive cultivation. The farmers who owned these vast operations spoke casually of production levels that would have been considered fantasy in Italy. The prisoners noted that these farmers were not aristocracy, not wealthy landowners of the traditional European type, just ordinary farmers. Yet they had electricity delivered to their farms through rural electrification programs. They had running water from powered pumps. They owned trucks for hauling crops. They owned personal automobiles for family transportation. They owned tractors, combines, and other mechanized equipment that represented more capital investment than entire Italian villages possessed collectively. At cotton processing facilities in Texas, former Italian tankers watched single electric-powered cotton gins process more raw cotton in 1 hour than their entire home regions could handle in a month using traditional labor-intensive methods. The facilities operated with skeleton crews because most young workers were in military service. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels through mechanization and electrical power that eliminated the need for human muscle. At a Campbell Soup Company factory in New Jersey, Italian prisoners watched automated production lines process more tomatoes in a single day than most Italian canning facilities handled in an entire month. One middle-aged woman monitored control panels that managed production processes that would have required 50 workers in Italy performing manual labor. She did this while listening to a radio for entertainment and drinking coffee during scheduled breaks. The factory operated far below its designed capacity because workers were scarce due to military conscription, yet it still exceeded normal production levels. Italian tankers, working at military supply depots, helping unload equipment, gained direct insight into American logistics that explained so much about their battlefield experiences. They saw warehouses filled with spare parts for tanks, trucks, and aircraft organized by part number in systematic cataloging systems. They watched trains arrive daily carrying artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and replacement engines. The abundance was overwhelming, beyond anything they had imagined. They had wondered in North Africa why Americans and British never seemed to run short of supplies, why damaged tanks returned to service so quickly, why ammunition was expended so freely without apparent concern for conservation. Now they understood completely. The Americans did not have supply lines in the traditional sense of careful rationing and controlled distribution. They had to supply rivers and oceans. They produced so much that shortage was literally impossible. Running out of supplies would require consumption rates that exceeded even the most extravagant battlefield expenditure. Corporal Martino Greco, who had served as a tank driver through the North African campaign before his capture in Tunisia, worked at a supply depot in Pennsylvania unloading Sherman tank components. He wrote in a letter that passed censors, describing his realization in careful terms. "We destroyed perhaps 20 American tanks during the entire Tunisia campaign across our regiment. I counted replacement turrets, engines, and transmissions at this one depot. There are enough spare parts here to rebuild 500 Shermans. This is one depot among dozens. The Americans can replace their losses faster than we could inflict them. We could not win. We could never have won. Mathematics made victory impossible." The transformation of Italian prisoners accelerated through late 1943 and into 1944 as the cumulative weight of daily observations, irrefutable facts, and personal experiences broke down the propaganda framework they had accepted since youth. They had been told that democracies were inherently weak, that Italy's fascist system was more efficient at mobilizing national resources, that American society was in cultural and economic decline, that individualism and capitalism produced selfishness rather than national strength. Everything they saw with their own eyes proved the opposite. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to dismiss as propaganda because they were living inside American society, working alongside American civilians, witnessing the actual functioning of democratic capitalism rather than hearing descriptions filtered through fascist ideology. Italian officers attended educational courses offered at the camps, programs developed by American universities providing correspondence education. Professors lectured about democratic governance, free market economics, and constitutional rights. The lectures were not crude propaganda in the sense of obvious lies or emotional manipulation. They were reasoned arguments backed by observable reality that prisoners could verify through their own experiences. Officers wrote to their families, when censorship permitted, that they had been taught democracies could not match Axis production because private companies valued profit over national service. Yet American factories owned by private companies and run for profit produced more tanks than all Axis nations combined, while also producing enormous quantities of every other weapon type, supplying allies through lend-lease programs, and maintaining the highest standard of living among all combatant nations. They had been taught that worker exploitation was necessary for military strength, that only through strict labor control and suppression of workers' rights could nations achieve maximum industrial output. Yet American workers, paid good wages and allowed to organize labor unions, built better weapons faster than Italian workers under strict fascist control. The fundamental assumption underlying fascist labor policy had been proven false by measurable results. They had been taught that racial diversity weakened nations, that only ethnically homogeneous societies could achieve true unity and strength. Yet America, a nation of immigrants from dozens of ethnic backgrounds, had mobilized more effectively than any other combatant power. The diversity that fascist ideology claimed was weakness had somehow produced strength, while the supposed purity fascist ideology celebrated had produced defeat. Every fundamental assumption they had been taught had been proven false by what they could observe directly. The propaganda framework collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. These men had fought for years believing in fascist principles. They had risked their lives because they believed the cause was just and victory was possible. Now they understood they had been lied to systematically about everything important. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought news that Italian prisoners followed intensely through American praetors, newspapers and radio broadcasts that were made available to them. 6,000 Allied ships transported 150,000 men in the first wave across the English Channel, establishing beachheads despite fierce German resistance. 11,000 aircraft provided air support, achieving complete air superiority that allowed ground forces to advance with minimal interference from the Luftwaffe. Italian prisoners at camps across America watched newsreels of the invasion within days of the landings, seeing footage of the massive fleet, the artificial Mulberry harbours being constructed to enable supply operations across open beaches, the endless streams of vehicles and supplies flowing ashore. The logistics that delivered 15,000 tons of material daily across the invasion beaches demonstrated organizational capability and industrial capacity beyond what Italian forces had ever achieved, even during their best periods. Officers watching the newsreels in camp recreation halls turned to their fellow prisoners and spoke truths that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Italy challenged this industrial power with Fiat trucks and M13 tanks that broke down in the desert. We went to war against this believing propaganda that claimed America was weak and decadent. We were mad. We were criminally, stupidly mad to think we could win. Throughout their captivity, Italian prisoners experienced something they had not expected based on propaganda about American brutality and vengeance. They experienced humanity. Despite propaganda depicting Americans as ruthless and eager for revenge, prisoners discovered a people who carefully distinguished between Italian soldiers and the fascist regime that had led Italy into disastrous war. American guards explained repeatedly that they were fighting Mussolini and Hitler, not the Italian or German people. When prisoners received Red Cross messages about family deaths in Allied bombing raids on Italian cities, American camp commanders personally delivered the terrible news and offered genuine condolences. When prisoners' families fell ill in Italy, American church groups helped send medicine through neutral channels like the Vatican or Red Cross. These small acts of kindness, repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps, challenged the prisoners' understanding of their former enemies. The propaganda had depicted Americans as cruel, vindictive, obsessed with revenge against those who had killed American soldiers. The reality was far more nuanced. Americans seemed to hold no personal hatred toward Italian prisoners, treating them as men who had followed orders and fought for their country, even if that country had been led by a regime Americans despised. The medical treatment particularly affected Italian tankers who had been wounded before capture or who fell ill during captivity. Tank injuries were often severe due to the nature of armored combat: burns from vehicle fires, shrapnel wounds from shell fragments, crushing trauma from vehicle rollovers or collisions. American military hospitals provided care that exceeded what German or Italian facilities had offered even to their own soldiers. Penicillin, the miracle antibiotic drug that had been developed primarily in American and British laboratories, was used freely on prisoners without hesitation. Italian medical officers who worked in camp hospitals later testified in letters and post-war interviews that American doctors used this expensive, life-saving medicine without any discrimination. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in Italian hospitals, where penicillin was virtually unavailable, recovered because Americans gave them the same treatment American soldiers received. After Italy's armistice with the Allies on September 8, 1943, the status of Italian prisoners in American camps changed significantly. Approximately 90% of Italian prisoners, around 45,000 men, agreed to cooperate with the Allied war effort as Italian service units. These men were given better quarters, issued American uniforms with Italian insignia to distinguish them from regular American soldiers, granted increased freedoms including supervised passes to nearby towns, and given opportunities to interact with Italian-American communities. They worked in ports, loading supplies, at supply depots, organizing equipment, in support roles that freed American soldiers for combat duty. They were paid small wages that allowed them to purchase personal items. They attended English language classes and vocational training programs. They were being prepared not just to return home eventually, but to participate in building a new democratic Italy after fascism's inevitable defeat. The remaining 10% who maintained fascist allegiance and refused cooperation were separated into dedicated facilities like Camp Hereford in Texas, where they received standard prisoner treatment under Geneva Convention rules, but without the privileges granted to cooperative prisoners. These men, true believers in fascist ideology even after Italy's surrender, became increasingly isolated as evidence of Axis defeat mounted, and the logic of their continued resistance became indefensible. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion through late 1944 and into 1945, Italian prisoners faced repatriation with emotions more complex than simple joy at returning home. Many had been in America for 2 years. They had eaten better as prisoners than they had as soldiers or even as civilians before the war. They had been treated with dignity by enemies who had thoroughly defeated them. They had witnessed a society that actually worked, that produced material abundance, that proved democracy could function effectively, rather than descending into chaos as fascist propaganda had always claimed. The final months of captivity were spent in preparation programs for return. American authorities provided vocational training in trades like automotive mechanics, welding, and electrical work that would be valuable in post-war reconstruction. They offered agricultural education, teaching modern farming techniques using mechanized equipment and scientific methods. They provided political instruction about democratic governance, constitutional rights, and civic participation in free societies. The prisoners were being deliberately prepared to return not as defeated soldiers nursing grievances and resentment, but as potential citizens of a new democratic Italy who understood how free societies functioned and could contribute to reconstruction. The Americans understood that these men would be influential in post-war Italy through their military experience, their officer ranks, and their direct knowledge of what democratic capitalism had achieved. They were being educated as ambassadors for the democratic system that had defeated them. Between 1945 and 1947, tens of thousands of Italian prisoners returned to Italy through repatriation programs. The country they found was devastated beyond what most had imagined during their captivity. Cities had been bombed into rubble by Allied air campaigns. Infrastructure was destroyed, with bridges collapsed, roads cratered, rail lines severed. The economy had collapsed with industrial production at a fraction of pre-war levels. Food shortages caused widespread hunger and famine in some regions. The fascist government that had sent them to war was gone, swept away by military defeat and popular uprising. Mussolini had been killed by Italian partisans in April 1945. His body hung in a public square in Milan as crowds jeered. The monarchy that had supported fascism was discredited and would be abolished by referendum in 1946. Democratic institutions were being established, fragile and uncertain, struggling to function amid the chaos of defeat and occupation. But these returning prisoners brought something valuable that helped Italy begin its remarkable recovery. They brought knowledge of how a democratic industrial society actually functioned, rather than theoretical understanding filtered through propaganda. They had seen efficiency achieved without tyranny. They had witnessed prosperity created without conquest. They had learned that national strength came from freedom rather than control, from educated workers rather than obedient subjects, from innovation rather than conformity. Former Tank Sergeant Rossini returned to his village in Lombardy in July 1946, finding his family's farm barely functional after years of neglect and requisition. Using techniques he had learned working on American farms as a prisoner, he mechanized operations, improved crop yields through better seeds and fertilization, and increased production significantly. Within 5 years, his farm was among the most productive in the region. He credited his time in America with teaching him that farming could be a science rather than just tradition. Former Lieutenant Ferrara, his war wound leaving him with limited shoulder mobility that ended any military career, found work in the Fiat automobile factories in Turin that were rebuilding after Allied bombing. Using manufacturing techniques he had observed in American factories while a prisoner, he helped reorganize production lines for greater efficiency. He became a strong advocate for worker training programs and quality control systems modeled on American industrial practices. By the 1950s, he was a plant manager overseeing production of cars for Italy's growing middle class. Former Captain Benedetti entered politics, serving in local government, and eventually winning election to the Italian Chamber of Deputies. He became known as a strong advocate for democratic institutions, for Italy's participation in NATO and the Western Alliance, for economic ties with the United States through the Marshall Plan. In speeches, he spoke openly about his experiences as a prisoner, describing how witnessing American society had transformed his understanding of democracy and capitalism. The Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, when Italy experienced the fastest economic growth of any European nation, was built partly on knowledge gained by former prisoners of war and partly on American Marshall Plan aid that provided capital for reconstruction. Former prisoners brought American manufacturing methods to Italian industry. They implemented agricultural techniques learned on American farms. They supported democratic institutions because they had seen democracy work effectively, rather than merely accepting it as a theoretical ideal. Historians who have studied the Italian prisoner of war experience in America note remarkable statistics that speak to how the treatment affected these men's attitudes. Of the tens of thousands of Italian prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1% attempted escape despite numerous opportunities. Post-war surveys conducted in the 1950s showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Thousands maintained correspondence with American families they had met during captivity for decades after the war. Many eventually immigrated to America in the 1950s and 60s when immigration quotas allowed. The technical specifications tell part of the story about why Italian tankers were defeated. The M13/40 weighed 14 tons with 30 to 42 millimeters of armor and a 47 millimeter gun, producing modest penetration at combat ranges. The Sherman weighed 30 to 33 tons depending on variant, with 51 to 64 millimeters of frontal hull armor, heavily sloped for superior protection, 76 millimeters on the gun mantlet, and a 75 millimeter gun that could penetrate significantly more armor at longer ranges. The Sherman's engine produced 400 horsepower compared to the M13's 125 or the M14's 145. The Sherman had a 5-man crew with dedicated roles, allowing faster reaction times. The Sherman had superior vision devices, better communications equipment, more reliable mechanical systems, easier maintenance requirements, and growth potential for future upgrades. In virtually every measurable category, the Sherman was superior, but the deeper story is about systems rather than individual machines. Italy produced approximately 3,000 tanks on the M13/40 chassis and its variants during the entire war, plus smaller numbers of other types. America produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1946, more than all German tank production of all types combined. American industry built tanks faster than they could be destroyed in combat. Italian industry could not replace losses at rates that sustained effective military operations. The M13/40 required skilled craftsmen to manufacture, limiting production rates to a maximum of 70 tanks per month, even under optimal conditions. The Sherman was designed from the beginning for mass production using automotive manufacturing principles, with production rates exceeding 2,000 tanks per month at peak across multiple factories. One American factory alone could produce more tanks than Italy's entire annual output. This production capacity was replicated across every category of military equipment: aircraft, trucks, artillery pieces, ammunition, all produced in quantities that Italy could not approach. The Italian tankers who fought Shermans in Tunisia were not defeated primarily by better soldiers, though American forces improved rapidly through combat experience. They were not defeated primarily by superior tactics, though American doctrine evolved effectively. They were defeated by an economic system that could sustain total war on a global scale, while their own economy collapsed under the strain. Historians who have studied Italian armor in World War II generally conclude that the M13/40 was not a terrible tank by 1940 standards when it entered service. It was adequate for its time, comparable to contemporary British cruiser tanks, and superior to the light tanks that dominated many armies' inventories. The problem was that by 1942 it was obsolete, and Italy lacked the industrial capacity to design, produce, and field a successor in meaningful numbers. Italian engineers understood what needed to be done. They designed improved tanks like the P40, which would have been competitive with Shermans if produced in quantity. But Italy's industrial capacity could not manufacture the P40 in numbers sufficient to make any difference. Only a handful were completed before the armistice, and they never saw combat with Italian forces. The industrial gap, not the engineering gap, determined outcomes. Italian tankers fought courageously with increasingly obsolete equipment against enemies with superior material resources. Their defeat was inevitable not because of cowardice, incompetence, or poor leadership, though all three existed in some units at various times. Their defeat was inevitable because of mathematics, a 3-to-1 disadvantage in numbers combined with a technological gap that made each individual Sherman superior to each individual M13. 40 inches nearly every measurable category meant that no amount of courage or tactical skill could achieve victory. But this is also a story about transformation and redemption. The Italian prisoners who witnessed American industrial might firsthand did not just learn that they had been outmatched militarily. They learned why. They saw an economic and political system that produced abundance through freedom rather than scarcity through control. They saw a society where ordinary people lived better than Italian elites. They saw democracy functioning effectively rather than collapsing into chaos. They returned to Italy as advocates for democracy and capitalism, helping build a nation that would become one of America's closest allies in Europe. The Italian tankers who mocked the Sherman's 75mm gun in early engagements, believing their 47mm was adequate, learned through bitter experience that guns were only one factor among many that determined armored combat outcomes. They learned that reliability, maintainability, crew ergonomics, optical quality, ammunition capacity, and logistical support mattered as much as armor and firepower. Most importantly, they learned that these factors reflected deeper truths about the societies that produced the weapons. Democratic capitalism, whatever its flaws and contradictions, had proven more effective at mobilizing resources and producing military power than fascist authoritarianism. This lesson, learned at terrible cost through years of combat and captivity, would shape Italy's post-war development for generations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.